March 1945. The war in Europe was reaching its final chaotic crescendo, and two of history's most legendary tank commanders were about to face off in a confrontation that would define everything we thought we knew about armored warfare. On one side stood Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, the man who literally wrote the book on panzer tactics, the general whose theories had conquered nations and whose name struck fear across 3 continents. On the other side was George S. Patton, the American general who read that book, laughed at it, and decided to rewrite the entire thing in blood and gasoline. What happened next wasn't just a military victory. It was a masterclass in how audacity can defeat doctrine, how instinct can triumph over intellect, and how one man's refusal to follow the manual became the very thing that destroyed the reputation of the man who wrote it. This is the story of how Patton humiliated Guderian. And before we dive into this incredible tale, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because stories like this don't get told anywhere else. The relationship between these two titans of armored warfare was complicated long before they ever came close to meeting on the battlefield. Guderian had published his seminal work Achtung Panzer in 1937, a revolutionary text that fundamentally reimagined how tanks should be used in modern warfare. Before Guderian, tanks were seen as infantry support, slow-moving fortresses that would accompany foot soldiers across no man's land. Guderian saw something else entirely. He envisioned concentrated armor acting as an independent striking force, punching through enemy lines at lightning speed, creating chaos in the rear, cutting supply lines, and collapsing entire defensive networks before the enemy even realized what was happening. His theories were vindicated spectacularly in the opening years of the war. Poland fell in weeks. France, the mighty French military machine that had held the Germans at bay for 4 years in the previous war, collapsed in a matter of months. The Low Countries, the Balkans, the initial drives into the Soviet Union, all of these campaigns bore Guderian's fingerprints. His panzers moved with a speed and coordination that seemed almost supernatural to observers. Military academies around the world studied his tactics. His principles became doctrine. And Guderian himself became something of a legend, the Panzer Prophet, whose vision had changed warfare itself. Patton knew all of this. He had read Guderian's work. He had studied the German campaigns in detail. He understood the theory behind Blitzkrieg probably better than most of Guderian's own officers. But Patton had also seen something that Guderian perhaps hadn't fully appreciated in his own doctrine, which was that the principles of armored warfare weren't uniquely German, they were universal, and more importantly, they could be executed with even greater ruthlessness and speed if you were willing to take risks that made even Guderian nervous. Patton had proven this in North Africa, in Sicily, and spectacularly in the breakout from Normandy and the subsequent race across France. While British Field Marshal Montgomery was carefully consolidating his positions and ensuring his supply lines were secure, Patton was already 3 steps ahead, his tanks racing across the French countryside so fast that they were literally running out of fuel. Not because they were outrunning their logistics, but because Patton refused to slow down even when the supply officers begged him to. His philosophy was simple and terrifying. Speed is armor. Aggression is defense. The enemy can't hit what they can't catch, and they can't organize a response to an attack that never stops coming. By early 1945, the strategic situation had become desperate for Germany. The Red Army was crushing in from the east. The Western Allies were pressing from the west. Germany's industrial base was being systematically destroyed by around-the-clock bombing. The Wehrmacht was fighting on multiple fronts with diminishing resources, green recruits, and aging equipment. In this context, Hitler made a decision that would prove catastrophic. He appointed Guderian as chief of the General Staff of the Army, effectively putting him in charge of coordinating Germany's defense. On paper, this made sense. Guderian was brilliant, experienced, and understood mobile warfare better than anyone. But there was a problem. Guderian's theories worked magnificently when you had the initiative, when you could choose when and where to attack, when you could mass your forces and punch through weak points. But now, Germany didn't have the initiative. They were defending everywhere and strong nowhere. The very principles that had made Guderian successful in attack were proving difficult to apply in defense. And more problematically, Guderian found himself trapped between military reality and Hitler's increasingly delusional demands for counterattacks and holding untenable positions. Patton, meanwhile, was preparing for what would become his finest hour. After the brutal fighting in the Battle of the Bulge, where he had famously wheeled his entire Third Army 90 degrees north in a matter of days to relieve Bastogne, an operation that military historians still study as a logistical miracle, Patton was ready to finish the job. His target was the Rhine, Germany's last major natural barrier in the West. Crossing the Rhine had been a nightmare scenario for military planners. The river was wide, fast-flowing, and heavily defended. The Germans had spent months fortifying the eastern bank. They had positioned artillery, dug in infantry, and placed their remaining armor reserves in positions to counterattack any crossing attempt. Standard doctrine called for weeks of preparation. Massive artillery bombardments, air support, engineering units building pontoon bridges under fire, the whole elaborate set piece of river crossing operations. Patton looked at this standard doctrine and decided it was garbage. On the night of March 22, 1945, elements of Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine near the town of Oppenheim. They did it with assault boats. They did it without a massive preparatory bombardment that would have alerted every German unit within 50 miles. They did it so quietly and so quickly that the German defenders barely realized what was happening until American infantry were already on the eastern bank establishing a bridgehead. By the time German command understood that a crossing was underway, it was too late to organize an effective response. Patton had his bridgehead. Within 24 hours, engineers had constructed pontoon bridges, and American armor was pouring across the Rhine. Patton famously stopped in the middle of the pontoon bridge, urinated into the Rhine in a gesture of contempt for the German defenses, and then called his superior, General Omar Bradley, to inform him of the crossing. The call was pure Patton. He was casual, almost offhand about the whole thing, as if crossing the Rhine without permission, without massive preparation, without following any of the approved procedures, was just another day at the office. The crossing itself was spectacular. But what came next was what truly humiliated Guderian and everything he represented. Because once Patton had his armor across the Rhine, he didn't consolidate. He didn't pause to bring up supplies. He didn't wait for his flanks to be secured. He unleashed his tanks in a driving offensive that made the original Blitzkrieg look cautious by comparison. Patton's Third Army exploded eastward into Germany with a speed and violence that stunned both the Germans and the other Allied commanders. In the span of days, American armor was racing across Germany, bypassing strongpoints, ignoring their flanks, creating chaos across the entire German defensive network. Towns that the Germans had planned to defend for weeks fell in hours. Supply depots were overrun before they could be evacuated or destroyed. German units found themselves cut off, surrounded, or simply overwhelmed by an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. The irony was exquisite and brutal. Guderian was watching the principles he had pioneered being used against Germany with a ferocity and audacity that exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had achieved. Every tactic he had developed, every principle he had advocated, concentration of force, speed over security, maintaining momentum at all costs, disrupting enemy command and control, These were all being executed by Patton with a savage perfection that Guderian must have found both impressive and horrifying. The German command structure was paralyzed. They couldn't track where Patton's spearheads were. They couldn't organize coherent defensive lines because by the time they identified where Patton was, he had already moved 50 miles further east. Communications were breaking down. Units were losing contact with headquarters. The entire carefully organized German defensive strategy was collapsing, not because it was poorly conceived, but because Patton was moving too fast for any defensive strategy to matter. What made this even more humiliating for Guderian was that he understood exactly what was happening. He wasn't some hidebound traditionalist who couldn't grasp modern warfare. He had invented modern armored warfare. He knew that Patton was using his own principles against him. He knew that the correct response would be to mass armor reserves for a concentrated counterattack, to hit Patton's spearheads when they were extended and vulnerable, to use Germany's interior lines to shift forces quickly and trap the Americans in a pocket. But Guderian couldn't execute any of this. Hitler was interfering with every operational decision. The armor reserves that Guderian needed were being held back for politically motivated counterattacks or distributed piecemeal across too many sectors. The fuel that was desperately needed wasn't available. The veteran troops who could execute complex mobile operations had been ground down in years of brutal fighting. And, perhaps most frustratingly, even when Guderian could identify opportunities to strike back at Patton, by the time approval came through the Byzantine German command structure and units could be moved into position, Patton had already moved on. The speed of Patton's advance was genuinely extraordinary. In less than 2 weeks after crossing the Rhine, the Third Army had advanced over 200 miles into Germany. They had liberated thousands of square miles of territory. They had captured tens of thousands of German soldiers. They had disrupted the entire German defensive network in the West. And they had done all of this while taking relatively light casualties compared to the grinding attritional battles that characterized much of the war. Patton's losses were minimal, not because he was cautious, but because he was so aggressive that the Germans never had time to organize proper defensive positions. His tanks were moving through areas so quickly that German artillery couldn't get accurate firing solutions. His infantry was clearing towns before the defenders could establish proper fields of fire. The entire operational tempo was so high that the Germans were constantly reacting, never acting, always one step behind, always trying to respond to the last crisis, while new crises were already developing. For Guderian, this must have been a nightmare. He was effectively watching his life's work being turned against Germany by someone who understood his theories but wasn't constrained by German military culture or Hitler's interference. Patton didn't have to deal with a dictator second-guessing every operational decision. Patton didn't have to worry about offending powerful Nazi Party officials who had been given military commands they weren't qualified for. Patton didn't have to operate within the rigid structures of German military hierarchy. He could take risks that Guderian probably would have loved to take but couldn't. He could ignore his flanks when every German general was trained to obsess over flank security. He could outrun his supply lines because American logistics, while not perfect, were so vastly superior to Germany's at this stage of the war that Patton could afford to be reckless in ways that would have been suicidal for a German commander. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Guderian had built his reputation and his career on being the master of mobile warfare. His theories had been studied, copied, and implemented by militaries around the world. He was, in many ways, the defining figure of armored warfare in World War II. And now, in the final months of the war, an American general was demonstrating that not only could these theories be executed by non-Germans, they could be executed better, faster, and more ruthlessly than Guderian himself had ever managed. Every report that came into German headquarters of another American breakthrough, another supply depot captured, another town liberated, was effectively a statement that Patton understood Guderian's principles more deeply than the Germans currently defending against him. There's a specific incident that encapsulates this entire dynamic. As Patton's forces were racing east, they encountered German units that were attempting to establish defensive positions along a river line. Standard doctrine, both German and American, would call for a careful approach. You would reconnaissance the position, bring up artillery, soften the defenses, and then launch a coordinated assault. Patton's forces did none of this. They hit the German positions at full speed with tanks in the lead, infantry following in half-tracks, artillery firing on the move. The German defenders were still setting up their positions when the Americans crashed into them. The defensive line that German planners had expected to hold for at least a few days was overrun in hours. The German commander, when he was captured, reportedly said he had never seen anything like it, that the Americans were fighting like it was an exercise with no regard for casualties or proper procedure. What he didn't understand was that this wasn't recklessness. It was calculated aggression. Patton had studied the situation and determined that speed would minimize casualties more effectively than caution. He was right. Guderian, meanwhile, was fighting a different kind of battle. He was trying to convince Hitler that Germany needed to adopt a mobile defense, to trade space for time, to use their remaining armored reserves in concentrated counterattacks, rather than spreading them thin across static defensive lines. But Hitler was obsessed with holding every inch of German soil. Every suggestion Guderian made was met with resistance or outright refusal. The Führer's orders were to hold positions that were militarily untenable. Resources were being wasted on meaningless defensive battles instead of being conserved for strategic withdrawals and concentrated counterstrokes. Guderian found himself in the absurd position of being Germany's chief military strategist, while having almost no ability to actually implement strategy. He could see exactly what needed to be done. He had the theoretical knowledge to defend against Patton's offensive, but he was trapped in a system that wouldn't allow him to apply that knowledge. The contrast between Patton and Guderian's situations in March of 1945 is striking. Both were brilliant military theorists. Both understood armored warfare at a profound level. Both were aggressive by temperament and training. But Patton was operating in a system that, for all its flaws, generally allowed talented commanders to take initiative and make operational decisions without constant interference from political leadership. Eisenhower gave Patton considerable latitude because he knew Patton delivered results. Bradley might not have always liked Patton's methods, but he understood that Patton's aggressive approach was winning battles. Guderian had no such freedom. Every decision had to be approved by Hitler. Every operational plan had to navigate a maze of Nazi Party politics. Every resource allocation was subject to interference from people who had no military competence but enormous political power. Guderian was trying to conduct a sophisticated mobile defense with one hand tied behind his back, while Patton was unleashed with essentially unlimited freedom to execute his vision of warfare. As March turned into April, the situation became even more lopsided. Patton's Third Army linked up with other Allied units, encircling the Ruhr pocket and trapping hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. His forces pushed into Czechoslovakia and were racing toward Austria. Everywhere Patton went, German defenses collapsed. This wasn't because the German soldiers weren't brave or well-trained. It was because the operational tempo was so high that bravery and training couldn't compensate for the fundamental collapse of German strategic coherence. Units were out of communication with higher headquarters. Supply systems had broken down. Officers had no clear picture of where friendly forces were, let alone where the enemy was. The Wehrmacht in the West was effectively ceasing to exist as a coherent fighting force, dissolving into isolated pockets of resistance surrounded by American armor that was already miles beyond them, pushing deeper into Germany. Guderian's final humiliation came on March 28th, when Hitler relieved him of command. The official reason was health issues, but everyone knew the real reason was that Guderian had been too vocal in his opposition to Hitler's strategic decisions. He had argued too forcefully for a rational defense strategy. He had pushed back too hard against suicidal orders. And so the man who had pioneered Blitzkrieg, who had proven that armored warfare could change the face of combat, who had won spectacular victories in the early years of the war, was dismissed in disgrace, sent away to watch from the sidelines as everything he had built crumbled. Less than 2 weeks after Guderian was relieved, Patton's forces were over 300 miles east of the Rhine, having torn through Germany with a speed that exceeded even the most optimistic Allied projections. The contrast was complete. The student had not just matched the teacher, he had surpassed him so thoroughly that the teacher had been dismissed in failure while the student drove toward total victory. The question that historians have debated ever since is whether Guderian could have stopped Patton if he had been given a free hand. It's an interesting counterfactual. Guderian certainly understood what needed to be done. He knew that Germany's only hope was a mobile defense using concentrated armor counterattacks. He understood that holding static lines was suicide against an enemy with air superiority and overwhelming material advantage. But even if Hitler had given Guderian complete freedom, it's not clear he could have stopped Patton. By March 1945, Germany simply didn't have the resources to execute the kind of sophisticated mobile defense that would have been necessary. The fuel wasn't there. The veteran troops weren't there. The tanks weren't there. The air cover definitely wasn't there. Patton was operating with complete air superiority, with effectively unlimited fuel and ammunition, with fresh troops and new equipment. Guderian was trying to defend with exhausted soldiers, aging equipment, fuel shortages, and the constant threat of Allied fighter bombers attacking any German formation that showed itself in daylight. But beyond the material factors, there was something else at play. Patton had internalized Guderian's principles, but wasn't constrained by them. Guderian had developed his theories in the context of German military culture, which, for all its emphasis on aggression, still had certain built-in assumptions about proper procedure, flank security, and maintaining organized command structures. Patton had learned the principles but operated in American military culture, which was much more tolerant of improvisation, individual initiative, and bending the rules. Patton could do things that Guderian probably wouldn't have even considered because they seemed too reckless, too contrary to proper military procedure. That willingness to violate doctrine, to do things that went against the manual, was precisely what made Patton so devastatingly effective and so impossible for Guderian to counter. The Rhine crossing itself was the perfect example. Every military manual said you needed extensive preparation for a river crossing. Guderian would have agreed with this. He was audacious, but he wasn't reckless. He believed in careful preparation and then violent execution. Patton looked at those manuals and said that extensive preparation just gives the enemy time to prepare their defenses. He crossed the Rhine with assault boats and infantry, got his bridgehead, and then exploited it immediately. It was completely contrary to doctrine, and it worked brilliantly precisely because it was unexpected. The German defenders were positioned to deal with the kind of set-piece river crossing that doctrine called for. They weren't positioned to deal with Patton's approach. By the time they realized what was happening, American armor was already across and driving east. This brings us to the larger point about military doctrine and its limitations. Doctrine exists for good reasons. It codifies lessons learned from previous battles. It provides a framework for training and operations. It ensures that different units can work together because they're all operating from the same playbook. But doctrine can also become a straitjacket. It can prevent commanders from seeing opportunities that exist outside the framework. It can make armies predictable. And when you're facing an enemy who knows your doctrine because they studied it, who understands your principles because they're universal, but who isn't bound by your organizational culture or your specific interpretation of those principles, you're in trouble. That was Guderian's situation. Patton knew how Guderian thought because he had read Guderian's books. But Guderian couldn't predict what Patton would do because Patton was willing to do things that the manual said you shouldn't do. The post-war years were kind to both men in different ways. Patton died in December 1945 from injuries sustained in a car accident, forever cementing his legend as a warrior who lived and died in the crucible of war. Guderian survived, wrote his memoirs, and spent the rest of his life as a respected military theorist and historian. His reputation was rehabilitated in the West during the Cold War when his expertise on fighting the Soviets became valuable. But he never really escaped the shadow of the war's final year, never fully addressed the fact that his theories had been used against Germany more effectively than Germany had used them in defense. In his memoirs, Guderian barely mentioned Patton, whether this was because it was too painful to confront or because he genuinely didn't see Patton's operations as particularly significant compared to the broader collapse of Germany is unclear. But the silence is telling. Military historians and theorists have spent decades analyzing what happened in those final months of the war. The consensus is that Patton's operations demonstrated several crucial principles about warfare that remain relevant today. First, doctrine is a starting point, not a destination. The best commanders understand the principles behind doctrine, but aren't enslaved by the specific procedures. Second, speed and aggression can be a form of force protection. Patton's forces took lighter casualties than units fighting more cautious battles, because they didn't give the enemy time to establish proper defenses. Third, logistics matter, but they shouldn't paralyze operations. Patton constantly outran his supply lines, but he did so with a clear understanding of how far he could push before he absolutely had to pause. Fourth, psychological effects matter as much as physical destruction. The chaos and confusion Patton created in the German rear areas was arguably more valuable than the actual ground his forces captured. For Guderian, these same operations represented a kind of Greek tragedy. He had developed revolutionary theories about warfare. Those theories had brought Germany spectacular victories. But in the end, those same theories, applied with even greater ruthlessness by an enemy commander who understood them deeply, contributed to Germany's catastrophic defeat. It's hard to imagine a more complete professional humiliation. Your life's work, turned against you, executed better than you could execute it yourself, by someone who wasn't even trying to prove a point, but was simply winning a war in the most efficient way possible. And through it all, Guderian had to watch, increasingly powerless, as his strategic vision was vindicated by its use against Germany, while his attempts to apply that same vision in Germany's defense were frustrated by political interference and material shortages. The story of Patton and Guderian is often told as a tale of American triumph over German military prowess. But it's more nuanced than that. It's a story about how knowledge transfer works in warfare, how theories developed in one context can be applied in another, how organizational culture shapes military effectiveness, and how personality and circumstance interact to produce historical outcomes. Guderian was a genius. Patton was a genius. They both understood armored warfare at a profound level. But Guderian was trapped in a failing system, bound by a dictator's interference, struggling with inadequate resources. Patton was empowered in a successful system, given latitude to operate, backed by overwhelming material superiority. The outcome wasn't predetermined, but it was heavily influenced by factors beyond pure military skill. One detail that often gets overlooked is how Patton's staff officers viewed his operations. Many of them were terrified by his recklessness. They could see on maps how exposed his flanks were, how extended his supply lines were, how vulnerable his spearheads were to counterattack. They kept expecting disaster. But Patton understood something they didn't. In modern mobile warfare, traditional concerns about flanks and supply lines mattered less than maintaining momentum. An exposed flank is only a problem if the enemy has time to organize an attack against it. Extended supply lines are only a problem if the enemy can interdict them. Patton was moving so fast that the Germans never had time to exploit his vulnerabilities. By the time German commanders identified an opportunity, Patton's forces had already moved on, and the opportunity had disappeared. This was Guderian's own theory, taken to its logical extreme. Patton had read the manual, understood it better than most of Guderian's own students, and then figured out how to push it further than the manual's author had imagined possible. The broader lesson here is about innovation in military affairs. Guderian was an innovator in the 1930s. His ideas were revolutionary, but by 1945, his ideas had become orthodox. They were being taught in military academies. They were the new doctrine. And like all doctrine, they came with built-in assumptions and limitations. Patton was operating in a different tradition. American military culture in World War II was less focused on theoretical elegance and more focused on practical results. American commanders were encouraged to improvise, to find solutions that worked, even if they weren't textbook perfect. This created an environment where someone like Patton could thrive, where his willingness to violate doctrine wasn't seen as insubordination, but as aggressive leadership. Guderian had helped create a new orthodoxy. Patton wasn't interested in orthodoxy at all. If we want to understand what really happened in March and April of 1945, we need to look beyond the simple narrative of American victory. We need to see it as a complex interaction between theory and practice, between doctrine and improvisation, between systemic factors and individual genius. Guderian gave the world a new way to think about armored warfare. Patton took that new way of thinking and demonstrated that it was even more revolutionary than its creator had realized. The principles of concentration, speed, and maintaining momentum that Guderian had pioneered could be pushed to extremes that seemed reckless, but were actually calculated risks based on a deep understanding of operational tempo and enemy decision cycles. Patton didn't humiliate Guderian by proving him wrong. He humiliated Guderian by proving him more right than Guderian himself had dared to be. The final irony is that Guderian spent his last days as chief of the General Staff trying to convince Hitler to implement the very strategies that Patton was using so successfully against Germany. Mobile defense, concentrated counterattacks, trading space for time, using armor as a strategic reserve rather than committing it piecemeal. Every one of these ideas was sound. Every one of them was based on principles Guderian himself had developed. But Hitler wouldn't listen. And so Guderian had to watch as Patton, operating on those same principles, destroyed the German defensive network in the West, while Guderian's own recommendations were ignored. It's hard to imagine a more bitter ending for a military career. You develop revolutionary theories. Those theories work brilliantly. But when you try to apply them to save your nation in its darkest hour, you're prevented from doing so by political interference. And meanwhile, your enemy is using those exact same theories to complete your nation's destruction. When you study this story, when you really dig into what happened in those crucial weeks in early 1945, you realize that wars aren't just won by material superiority or numerical advantage. Those things matter enormously, of course, Patton had better tanks, more fuel, air superiority, and a constant supply of reinforcements. But wars are also won by commanders who understand warfare at a level that allows them to see opportunities others miss, who can internalize principles so deeply that they can apply them instinctively in rapidly changing situations, who can balance aggression with calculation, and who can maintain operational tempo even when every conventional measure says they should pause and consolidate. Patton had all of these qualities. So did Guderian. But in March of 1945, only one of them had the freedom to apply these qualities without restriction. And that made all the difference. So if you enjoyed learning about how Patton humiliated Guderian by using Guderian's own principles against him with devastating effectiveness, make sure you hit that like button right now. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think would have happened if Guderian had been given complete freedom to implement his defensive strategy without Hitler's interference. Could he have stopped Patton, or was the material imbalance just too great by that point in the war? I want to hear your thoughts on this fascinating historical what-if. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because we've got more incredible untold stories from World War II coming your way. Stories about the battles, the strategies, the personalities that changed history. Stories that go beyond the simple narratives and dive deep into the complex reality of the war. This is where history comes alive. This is where you learn the details that textbooks leave out. So subscribe now, hit that notification bell, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll explore another incredible chapter from the greatest conflict in human history.